Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keisha Blain, and I'm currently an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm also the president of the African American Intellectual History Society. And this year, I am a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. It is my privilege to be able to join you this afternoon for the latest segment of the Social Justice Leader Series, a webinar series which I started last semester, which has provided a wonderful space to feature social justice leaders and activists working at the local, national, and international levels. And I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Professor Deborah D. Douglas. Professor Douglas is currently the Eugene S. Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at DePaul University and a senior leader with the OpEd Project, leading fellowships and programs that include the University of Texas at Austin, Dartmouth College, Columbia University, Urgent Action Fund in South Africa and Kenya, and Youth Narrating Our World. While teaching at her alma mater, Northwestern University's Medill School, she created a graduate investigative journalism capstone on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and taught best practices in Karachi, Pakistan. She is an award-winning journalist, a 2019 Studs Terkel awardee, and the founding managing editor of MLK50 Justice Through Journalism. She is the author of a new book entitled U.S. Civil Rights Trail, a traveler's guide to the people, places, and events that made the movement. And this was recently released by Moon Travel. Today, we will have an opportunity to talk a bit about that book, but really talk about Professor Douglas's broader work as a journalist and as an activist. And although we have not had an opportunity to meet in person, I had an opportunity to encounter Professor Douglas on Twitter, of all places, and largely through her work via MLK50, which we'll also talk about today. So I look forward to this conversation. We will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and I do invite you all to submit questions to us. You're welcome to submit questions at any time in the process, and toward the end, we will get to those questions. So welcome, Professor Douglas.
Thanks for having me. This is so exciting.
Thanks for agreeing to do this. And of course, we had an opportunity to collaborate with the 400 Souls Project. So thank you for agreeing to do that. And we may end up talking, I think, hopefully we'll see how time goes. We'll talk a little bit about your essay in 400 Souls. But I'd like to start, if you could really take us through the journey and tell us more about your background, what led you on the path to become a journalist. How have your thoughts and views on journalism shifted over the years?
Yeah, well, when I was a child, my rhythms were changing all the time. We moved around a lot. My parents split up early. My mother moved to a different city. So I'm a great migration baby. I was born in Chicago. I started school in post-uprising Detroit, where I could feel a certain kind of energy in the air. I was a kid. I didn't know what it was, but I knew there was something. And then I spent several years, most of junior high and high school, living with my grandmother in a small town outside of Memphis, with the town square complete with the Confederate statue, the whole thing. And in terms of what led me on the path is a real simple thing. I like to read. And I also noticed that adults didn't always know what they were doing. And it had to do with the fact that I didn't think they listened to each other very well. And so I put all these little things together, like what could I do to give people information and to get them into a conversation with each other where they actually could hear each other and get really good information and make good decisions. And so I decided for me that that was a journalist. It involved reading and writing. And at the time I was in thrall of TV news for what reason, I don't know, but so there was a little bit of glamour to it also. And in terms of how my thoughts and views have shifted over the years, I mean, my profession is mentioned in the Constitution. So in terms of like what I think about it, like that's what I think about it. But I think that, with such an awesome charge, I don't think that we necessarily fulfill our potential,
Right.
in terms of what we mean to the democratic experiment.
Yeah, and it's great hearing you talk about your childhood because, as you were reflecting on your observations, one thing just came to my mind as a child growing up in my household. There was always this statement that children should be seen and not heard, which was a sort of unfortunate, I think, framework because it was always this idea that adults knew best. You needed to not get in the way. You needed to listen, but you certainly did not need to, assert your voice. Of course, the irony is for your field, it is both listening carefully, as you point out, and asserting your voice. And so clearly that model, that motto, I think can really take away, I think, from children's ability to grow and to use their skills. And as you demonstrated, you were able to pull on all of these experiences, your love of reading, and your careful and perceptive nature to build a career, which I think has been a fascinating one. And you have deep roots in Chicago. So could you tell us about that and specifically how that informed your career and how you report on the city?
Well, yeah. So my father ran a business on the west side of Chicago. We were part of the second Great Migration to Chicago. He ran a body shop, and his body shop employed lots of young men who came up from Mississippi looking for work for the very first time. And so, like I said, I was born here, but we moved early, and I was in Detroit. I had these radical teachers. I had this radical Jewish teacher, Mr. Barish, who didn't teach us from books. He just sat and told us stories all day, mostly about the Holocaust. And the way you got a grade is that you wrote papers, and we didn't have art. So he encouraged us to illustrate our concepts in our papers. And I really loved that. And I was quite prolific at it. And I loved listening to Mr. Barish's stories. And then I had another teacher, Miss Smith, who now goes by Dijanaba Abubakari. She was a Pan-Africanist, and she is the one who introduced me to the motherland, really. And yeah, it's really all of these experiences. So, and then I moved, down south. And lately, I would say over the past 3 years, I've been really determined to claim all of my identities and all of my spaces and all of my geographies because they all feed me. Years ago, I said I'm a Northern girl with Southern sensibilities. So like, if you come to my house, I'm going to be a really great hostess, but also that, there's that like urban edge also, that like resourcefulness and getting it done as quick as possible. So that's how all of those experiences feed me.
Yeah, and tell us more about your work. As a professor, you're currently, as I mentioned earlier, the Eugene S. Pulliam Distinguished Visiting Professor of Journalism at DePaul University. How do you approach your teaching? What kinds of courses do you offer? And what are the core messages that you seek to convey to your students?
Oh, wow. So DePaul doesn't have a journalism major. So you can't make a lot of assumptions about what students know about the power and privilege of journalism or just the nuts and bolts of it. And so I have to capture them, and I want to make an impression on them that they can take with them the rest of their lives. And I believe that regardless if you're going to be a journalist or not, that we're all storytellers. And so I want to infuse my students with the ability to create quality stories. And so at DePaul, I've been able to create courses from scratch. And so part of that is sort of like addressing some of the gaps that I see in coverage. I've run newsrooms. So I've interfaced with lots of different people from all walks of life in terms of who's telling stories,
Mm-hmm.
or the gatekeepers who are making decisions about what goes in the paper or online or
Mm-hmm.
in the magazine. And so I've taught two modules of cross-cultural journalism. The second module is focused on engagement. It's because the industry is finally realizing that we really have to be out in our communities, in conversation with our audiences.
Yeah.
For so many years, we had this sort of like top-down approach to our audiences.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to give you this really great information, and you're going to absorb it because we gave it to you. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, uh, the generations that came after mine, have grown up in an environment with a sophisticated marriage of imagery and words. And you can't just give them information and say, I'm this authority figure, and expect them to just take it. The
Right.
most you can do is like approach them like you're maybe like a slightly older or worldly friend that they trust, and say, hey, I have this some really great information for you. It's well resourced, and I hope that you can take it and run with it. And
Mm-hmm.
so so I've tried to ground my students with some engagement tactics and strategies. We held a people supper one year. I was really super excited about that in our new Center for Diversity and Inclusion, and we invited a cross section of the wider community, not just the campus, but the wider community in Greencastle, Indiana, to come and sup with us. And
Mm-hmm.
I asked my students to think about who could benefit from talking across difference. And then that's how we came up with our guest list. I've also taught solutions journalism. I'm on fire for solutions journalism because it is an approach to showing how people are trying to solve social problems in their
Right.
communities. Yeah. And so a part of solutions journalism is um, we use something called asset framing
Mm-hmm.
versus deficit framing. Actually, I learned the term from Travian Shorters, a retired tech entrepreneur, and he
Mm-hmm.
is the founder of the Be Me communities. But basically, asset framing is defining people by their aspirations,
Mm-hmm.
or really fully in who they really are, as opposed to deficit framing, which is the tendency of news media, which is defining people by the worst possible thing that's ever happened to them.
Right.
So the South Side of Chicago becomes known as this place where only crime happens. But the South Side of Chicago is a geographic direction. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I literally am sitting in the South Side of Chicago right now. I live at 22nd Street, and 12th Street is where it kind of, officially kind of starts. And once you pass Roosevelt and you start going southward. And so the South Side is a collection of communities, that is a collection of neighborhoods. And so people are having all kinds of experiences. But if you
Right.
look at national news and you hear South Side of Chicago, you think it's just this huge crime-ridden place. And even in those communities where crime is more of a challenge than other communities, you still need to asset frame those communities, because people say in Inglewood, which has a high crime rate at times, those people get up every day and they have a vision for their lives,
Right. Right.
and and so why should they be deficit framed in their storytelling? They are trying to be the agents of their own salvation with whatever resources that they have. And so I think we need to do a better job of telling that story, and
Right.
then understanding the structural underpinnings that keep them from having all the resources that they need to affect change in their communities. So
Yeah.
I'm really excited about solution journalism for that reason.
Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, everything that you're saying really resonates with me. And, as a historian, especially because I think we encounter similar challenges in a way that we tell, the way that we tell historical narratives, the way that we write the history. You mentioned focusing on individual dreams and aspirations. And I think that's key. You mentioned agency, making sure that the way that we present stories to a broader public, that we're not losing sight, right, of the people in the communities that we're writing about. And I think the way that you framed it is so useful. And one of the reasons your work is so impactful, and one of the projects that you've been involved in, which I truly, I mean, I think it's a phenomenal project. And in fact, I tell people all the time that it's one of the reasons that I, now write op-eds and edit because of the OpEd Project. You're currently involved in the OpEd Project. For those who might not be familiar, could you describe the OpEd Project and then share what has been the most rewarding aspect of this work? And I think as you describe it, it would be useful to really just hit home to people how significant it is as an avenue for certainly for Black journalists and writers, but really for women, for people of color in general. It would be great to hear more about the OpEd Project in that framework.
Right. So the OpEd Project is designed to really change the shape of the public conversation by having underrepresented voices get their fair share of the public conversation. It was founded by Katie Orenstein, and the idea is to find experts. We started out focusing on women and expanded to underrepresented people, but really everybody is invited in our rooms because we think that everybody is part of the solution to changing the shape of the public conversation. And so, like, to be really practical, if you look at the nation's op-ed pages, you'll see that those voices are dominated by white male voices. And so you could be cynical and say, oh, well, they're keeping our voices out. Why won't they let us in? But it turns out that a lot of times that underrepresented people don't submit. And so we want to knock on that door and we want to start submitting more so that, because, we don't know what's on the other side, but we know that if we say what we have to say of consequence from a position of expertise, what we know stone cold, then we have a shot at changing the shape of the public conversation. And the OpEd Project is actually working with MIT to measure this. And we think that it makes a difference for more expert women's voices, more expert Black voices, brown voices, LGBTQ voices. It makes a difference for us to say what we have to say and really fuel and add momentum to the public conversation around issues. So, and I'm really excited about it because I get to work with the smartest people in the world. We run year-long fellowships at universities around the country. I've done this work overseas in Africa and South Africa and in Kenya. And we work with grassroots organizations, and I've even a couple of times worked with Why Now, Youth Narrating Our World, and that is a program that we put together for high school students. And one of our students, Donald Rapier, he came up with an idea the first day, and my colleague worked with him on sharpening his piece. It was published, and then a staffer for a New York State legislator plagiarized Donald's op-ed, but his words made it into a law. And so at first we're like, baby, did you plagiarize? He's like, no, man, it wasn't me, it was them. And so Donald went around and did like a round of press on CNN and NPR, and it was just really awesome. So, he's a kid and he's having an impact. I also work with Dr. Kristen Smith at the University of Texas at Austin.
Oh, yes, and I know her.
Yeah. So she's walking the walk and talking the talk. She created this movement called Cite Black Women. Yes. And so, I've worked with Dinah Ramey Berry, Callie Gross. You probably can tell Texas is my favorite. But I've worked with academics at Yale, Columbia, just finished a wildly successful program at Northwestern last fall. I had other work to do, but I wanted to be able to speak into the public conversation with regard to the election. And so I signed on to the Northwestern program for the sole purpose of hoping to meet some people who had some really great ideas that I could help give liftoff. And it worked.
Yeah, I think that I currently I'm one of the editors of the Washington Post Made by History section. And one of the things that's really fascinating is we keep close track of every single piece, and we document, the authors. We try to just keep track of the data, and we are quite intentional at trying to encourage authors from a wide array of backgrounds to contribute. But even still, we notice the same patterns that you point out. That most of the pitches that would come in, most of the submissions that come in, come from white men, and women. If we don't continue to be intentional in reaching out at times and in mentoring and encouraging, we could literally just sit and publish pieces all day long and never have women's voices, or hardly ever have women's voices, or hardly ever have voices of scholars of color. And there's so many factors at play, and I think, as you pointed, the OpEd Project is so key for I think transforming these spaces. And as you point out, we have to be able to share our own perspectives. We have expertise too, right? We have to share them. And it requires a lot of courage, especially in a moment where people can be very mean in the way they respond. You, as a journalist, understand. As I tell people, don't read the comment section, because if you do, it'll discourage you from writing the next op-ed. So you have to just write it, explain yourself to the best of your ability, and move on to the next piece, and worry very little about what people are saying in the comment section, because generally, I think people who have good feedback will take the time to message you. And you could have an extended dialogue if that's something that you're open to. But it is so important, I think, to have avenues like the OpEd Project. Another project that you've been involved in, of course, this is how we ended up connecting. I think perhaps just scrolling through my Twitter feed one day, came across MLK50. And started reading the pieces, which immediately I recognized as just being quite different in terms of everything else I was reading. The kinds of stories that were being covered, the topics really spoke to me, and of course you played a key role in that project. Could you talk about that project? For those who might be unfamiliar. And tell us what you learned from your time with MLK50, and the effort to, as you and your colleagues framed it, achieve justice through journalism. Tell us more about that.
So MLK50 Justice Through Journalism was actually conceived of, founded by Wendy C. Thomas, a longtime columnist at the Commercial Appeal, the paper of record in Memphis, Tennessee. And she was an assistant managing editor there too, before she stepped down, and she went and actually did a fellowship at Harvard. And so I guess, we're both traditional journalists in the sense that we're grounded in journalistic orthodoxy, but right there on the site, in the about section, we do admit to a bias in terms of censoring the community or censoring people. And so the difference in our approach was that we aim to center regular people as opposed to established power. And there's like a little trick to what happens in traditional news coverage that I'll go into in a second. But it's called MLK50 because it was established to cover Memphis, which was in the largest poor metro in the nation, in the year leading into the 50th commemoration of Dr. King's assassination there. And so Wendy pretty much figured that town leaders, thought leaders would probably, pat themselves on the back for a job well done for how far Memphis has come. But if you're a large port city that's based on a warehousing economy, which is really the promise, a never-ending promise of low-paid jobs, then you're not really living the principles that Dr. King taught us all. And so it was founded to keep track of that, but in real time with journalism. And then it went like gangbusters. And it was very well received, and we got more funding, and it's still going. I stepped down last summer. I was 3 years in because I have a lot of other jobs, but it's still going, and it's just doing some of the most impactful journalism around. So one example I wanted to give about shifting the perspective or recentering people, there are these assumptions that we have in news coverage. So, for example, when a new business comes to town, the coverage is about how many jobs are created, right? But does anybody ever ask, well, what's the quality of those jobs? Do those jobs pay a living wage? What percentage of those jobs are managerial jobs? Will those jobs help either feed or create a middle class? And if there are any tax breaks attached to that, how is that advantageous to regular working people? How will we get that money back? And how will we see the realization of that investment? Because very often communities don't see the proceeds of those investments. So we flipped everything upside down and looked at the world from the position of working people.
Yeah, which is exactly why I think it was so well received, because it was just a different model, right? A different way of approaching the news. And not surprisingly, we're able to uncover and continue to uncover just powerful stories that are transformative and make the work of of activists, of policymakers, I think all the more meaningful, because they have access to these stories, to these narratives, and they have a better sense of these communities. So thank you for that work. I wanted to ask you, of course, I'm a historian, so I have to ask, and every time I think about journalism, I can't, the first person who comes to mind is Ida B. Wells.
Yes.
And she's just, of course, I don't have to tell you just how remarkable in terms of her legacy, but I'm just curious, if you could talk about what she means to you, if you could talk about how her example influenced your approach to journalism and activism, which I think is clear goes hand in hand for the work you're doing.
Well, Ida B. Wells means everything to me. I discovered her when I was in junior high school. By that time, I was living with my grandmother in Covington, Tennessee, a small town outside of Memphis. And across the street from me was Professor Taylor's house. And the Taylors had generations of books that they gathered from matriculating through HBCUs. So their library was vastly different from the city library or the school library. And that was my library of preference. So I discovered her in their library. And, I wanted to be a journalist since I was 8 years old. And so here's this Black person, this Black woman who's a journalist. So she just became like an icon to me, like a beacon, but this is something that I really could do. And I just really liked the way she looked too. You don't necessarily see Black women in the iconography of the world. So I just like looking at her. So anything with her image, I would collect it and put it in a book.
Yes. I understand.
Yeah. So Nicole Hannah-Jones calls her America's first data journalist because of what she did with the Red Record. And journalism can be really hard on Black people. And a lot of us over the years, since the Kerner Commission allowed us to actually enter traditional newsrooms, haven't always been able to get the opportunity to delve into investigative stories or do data-driven journalism. Early on, we would get put on the cops beat. And even once we kind of broke through that, it's hard to get to that level of depth in investigative journalism. And, I've taken courses at the University of Missouri in computer assisted journalism and, always trying to prepare for like that next big thing. But it's a kind of training that is not often extended to us, which is why I'm really excited about the Ida B. Wells Society that was created by Nicole, because she's doing something about that barrier to access to that level of depth. So in my career, I have just done whatever I could, wherever I could. I approach my work like it's my business. I'm entrepreneurial in my coverage. So I don't go and work for someone else. I've never have. And it take orders. I'm always thinking like several steps ahead about how I want to be transformed in this quarter, in this year, and over the next 5 years. And so I have, run departments and created new titles. I was the editor-in-chief of the young adult edition of the Chicago Sun-Times, the Red Streak edition. I was a library director because once gave my editor the Young, Gifted, and Black talk. I'm like, I come here every day and there are people in my community that expect me to do great things. And he's like, why do we have to talk about Black stuff? I'm like, we're not having that Black conversation. We're having the one about me being part of the talented 10th and having to do big things. So, I got lots of responsibility through that when I was working at the Chicago Sun-Times, and eventually I made it to be the number 2 on the editorial board.
Awesome. And I want to make sure that we spend some time today talking about your new book, U.S. Civil Rights Trail, A Traveler's Guide to the People, Places, and Events that Made the Movement. Let's start with the beginning. And first tell us what the book is about. I think it's clearly descriptive, but even more so, through your, vision, if you could explain what the book is about, and then start with what motivated you, or maybe who or what motivated you to write this book.
Well, I'll tell you what happened is that in 2018, 12 Southern travel offices designated an official trail. And so that gave me the opportunity to curate and contextualize what that trail was about. So this is the first and only book that follows the Civil Rights Trail in the South. New sites are being added to the trail every day. If you go to civilrightstrail.com, they have Travel South has the most beautiful interactive website. And the trail starts as far east as Wilmington, Delaware, our first coup, and and it goes as far west as Kansas, and it goes deep into Florida and into Louisiana. Now, I couldn't go everywhere, but I had to choose enough places to go on that official trail to capture a narrative arc of the mid-century civil rights movement. And so, I needed a beginning, middle, and end, so to speak, and that can be, loose, but I had to make some decisions. So of course I go to Little Rock because of what that represented in terms of implementing Brown v. Board and in the mid 50s. And of course I go to Atlanta, first of all things Dr. King, but also like the Atlanta student movement and integration, so many other things. Memphis, because again, Dr. King, but also labor, because he was there for the sanitation workers strike. I have to go to the Delta, Emmett Till, catalytic force for the mid-century civil rights movement. And while I'm there, you might as well go to Jackson because things are going on there. Nashville, because of the movement there. Reverend James Lawson corrected me when I did an extensive interview with him on Nashville. Yes. I called it the Nashville Student Movement. And he said, no, young lady. He said, I was under thrall of white academics that wanted to make it seem like only students did the work. So he corrected me on that. And so, I had to be really careful of my language as I was crafting this book. I go to Charleston because I needed something that was foundational. How did we get here in the first place, right? And so because Charleston was a significant port for enslaved Africans, I needed to, go to Charleston to establish that. And I talk about other things there too. There's Mother Emanuel there, which is a more recent,
yes.
And the cigar factory worker strike, Black and white women work together to strike to get better wages and better working conditions there. So yeah. And of course I go to DC because all roads lead to DC.
Yes. And, I'm teaching a class now on the civil rights movement. And I think this is a book that would work well for students because, you mentioned Little Rock, and it's actually ironic that you mentioned, the critiques about how you used, how you mentioned the Nashville student movement. And we've been talking in the class about just the significant role of young people. We've been talking about Little Rock, certainly, and also college-age students, and thinking about folks in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But I think students would really appreciate your narrative because it reflects all of these key moments and that it also grounds us in places, right, and spaces. So we're able to go from city to city and think about how the movement unfolded in these specific locales. I would imagine that certainly in the post-COVID world, we can only hope that's coming soon, that people would be able to travel to these places and carry your book as a guide in exploring. What do you hope readers will take away from the book? I think to some extent you've touched on several key topics, but what do you hope readers will take away from this new project?
Well, I mean, I started out with the idea that this would be a travel book. So I was just really concerned about, sending people to the right cultural institutions or historic spaces, and then sending them to a good place to eat, something like that. But first of all, I purposed myself to include Black-owned businesses wherever possible. So with my book, unless otherwise stated, you're going to a Black-owned business. Because I felt like, what is the best way to show respect for this history and these communities than to invest in them in an intentional way,
right?
With something as small as a cup of coffee. And then I also have timelines in every chapter, because I think a lot of us have like this sort of like overarching idea of what the civil rights movement was about, but we're not really grounded in the particular issues of cities or regions.
Right.
And so then you get a sense of the local flavor and character of these places. And then I have playlists and I talk about the music. It's designed to entertain, but the book is designed to educate. Now, what started out as a travel book ended up being like a history book and a civics primer, because now you're understanding how these people, manage the levers of democracy, to press their cause. And also, I think it's a roadmap to activism too. And I actually have a resource guide in the back of the book. So I make suggestions on people you should read, movies, books, podcasts you should listen to. You're in there.
Oh,
you're in the Charleston chapter for the Charleston syllabus. And you're also a resource at the back of somebody that you must follow.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. And, of course, I think we discussed it when you came on earlier that I have not had a chance to read the book yet. So I'm really sorry.
That's okay. You've been busy.
Very busy, very busy. But I look forward to reading it. I'm thrilled to now know that I make an appearance. But we do have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. And I'd like to address one of them because it allows us to step back a bit and grapple more with our discussion earlier about journalism.
Yes.
And so the question is, and I'll just read it. I was struck by the mention of asset framing versus deficit framing early in the presentation. Is there something, that we could say more about, both? So, maybe for those who might have joined us a little late, I think it'd be useful to quickly define. And then maybe if you just want to reflect a little bit about the significance of your approach as it pertains to asset framing, as you've mentioned it a little bit earlier in our conversation.
Okay, so asset framing is when you define people by their aspirations. That's the way it was always explained to me. But I also add that you define people fully in who they are, like, a 363-degree perspective of our lives. Deficit framing is defining people or telling their story based on the worst possible thing that's ever happened to them. So if you are poor, then it's represented as this failure that defines you, right? This is another thing in my travel book. I was really careful about how I used the word slave and enslaved. Like I didn't use slave. And my white editor asked me about that at one point, and I explained to her that this is a condition. It's not an identity. It's not who they are at their core. So to call someone a slave is deficit framing. To call them enslaved presumes that, again, that they have agency that can be unlocked, that they have aspirations, a vision, that they have love in their lives and all these beautiful things. And it's not like a cheerleader way of covering people. It's just really covering people in the fullness and the truth of who they are. And
Yeah.
what happens in newsrooms is that people, especially marginalized communities, underrepresented communities, become reduced into, I don't know, just like this one-dimensional thing.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
their approach to coverage is this simple thing and never anything more.
And as you were explaining that, I think about it just even through a historical lens. But, I think about Haiti, for example, and I get so frustrated the way that to this very day, many writers, every time there's a mention of Haiti, it's framed as, quote, the poorest country of the Western Hemisphere. I hate it, but yet it keeps appearing everywhere. And it's become this sort of lazy way to talk about a nation. And I think, and so many historians, of course, would say, why not frame it differently? Why not say, I don't know, maybe the world's first Black-led republic?
Right.
That's key. Right. And I think it connects to your point, right, about how the way that we tell the stories, whether or not we are talking about communities or even just an entire nation, whether it's framed through these negative framings. And it's not to say that poverty, is not an issue. It's not to say that, that communities don't grapple, don't, struggle with poverty or deal with crime. But what does it mean to present them solely through that lens, and never, as you point out, even think about people's aspirations, people's hopes and dreams, and people's actual accomplishments too. And so I think that's a very useful framework, and one that I hope more writers, more journalists will continue to utilize. With the remain, yes, go ahead.
Right. I just wanted to add that when you rely on that deficit frame, it all boils down to personal responsibility. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, why can't they fix this one thing? Why?
Mm-hmm.
And then we never get to the discussion around systems, which I think is the whole purpose of journalism. And
Yeah.
I think we need to retool everything that we're doing and approach everything from a systems approach. But I see examples in the news every day where my ilk are not quite equipped to do that.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, the way that we've been talking about this connects to the piece that you wrote for 400 Souls, and which I just think is a phenomenal piece. And you wrote an essay on Hurricane Katrina, and so maybe if you could just, for those who are listening and watching in, if you could share a bit about that essay that you wrote, and specifically the concept that you introduced in that essay, which is what you describe as de-presencing. And I know it's, you will explain it better than I can. But can you connect it to tell us about the essay on Hurricane Katrina and this concept, which I think connects so powerfully to everything we've been discussing today?
Yeah, well, I was assigned by my editor, Dr. Kang, to write about Hurricane Katrina. And I was thinking, well, what are the issues? Well, what was going on there at the time? What has gone on subsequently? I even reflected back on stories that I wrote about it at the time, and at the 5-year anniversary. I very specifically remember I was on the editorial board at that time. And I'm like, okay, what do I care about now? Who do I care about now? I'm like, oh yeah, I care about Black women and how we're treated, and some of the structural barriers that keep us from being able to fully just pursue our vision and pursue our possibility. And so since I've been at DePauw, another conversation, because there's always like these little things swirling in my head, I was thinking about a sensation that I've experienced over my life and my career of sort of like, it's sort of like a feeling of being ignored. And I couldn't say that it was necessarily erasure, because I've been in situations where you have to be present to be erased. You have to be like in the space, in the room, in the narrative to be erased. And I've been physically in spaces where my humanity, my heat, has not even been acknowledged. And I'm like, I want to find a word to define that sensation. Because when I talk to other Black women in general, but I decided to focus specifically on the Black women's experience, I wanted to name that. And then I explored whether or not the women of Katrina experienced that too. I wanted to find the connection. So I did research to see if I could validate my hunch. And so I call it depresencing. That's the word that I coined. And it's just really the failure of white patriarchy to acknowledge the humanity, the heat, the presence of Black women in physical spaces and narratives. And that's exactly what happened to the women of Katrina. They were clearly in this space and they were not acknowledged. They used deficit framed language, like calling the people of New Orleans refugees instead of evacuees, as if we don't lay claim to this place and that we did not build this country. And so, I start off with an anecdote for the first time that I felt depresenced in a space. And then I connected it to what happened with the women of Katrina. But the thing about depresencing, it's such a violent thing to never have your humanity acknowledged. And so you can't communicate, you can't connect, you can't get your story in the narrative, which becomes policy and norms, right? But we show up anyway. I mean, literally, when I talk to my girlfriends, it's like, how are you showing up today? How are you showing up today in the face of whatever challenge that that you're facing? We represence ourselves. That's the other side of depresencing. We represence. But again, like I said, I think that understanding the structural underpinnings of how this society is built can help us make a better society. And so I think having names for things helps us to unpack that, which is why I'm so excited about like Moya Bailey's Misogynoir, or Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. That's how I pitched my column at the Chicago Sun-Times. I'm like, I've had this intersectional upbringing, and I'm not like the other Black woman who writes a column who's older than I am. I have a different experience, and Black people are not a monolith. At the time I was married, I had a white husband, and I'm like, there are other kinds of experiences that we can bring into our conversations.
Yeah. As we're coming toward the end, I think this is a good time to really connect and reflect on one, certainly the present moment, but also looking to the future. And a couple of the questions that have come in are along those lines. So someone actually has a question which I think connects to your book, as we were talking about the civil rights movement, and they wanted to know what your thoughts were on leadership in the Black community, and specifically the way they framed it is with all of the focus on the marketing of the self, as they phrased it. Do you think it will be difficult to have leaders emerge like Dr. King or Malcolm X? And I guess I'll sort of add to that question with to simply, one, maybe I'll say, and Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer.
Thank you.
And Angela Davis, right? I don't know. I mean, Angela Davis is still with us, but I guess my thinking is someone, maybe the point of it is to reflect more so on leadership, what that looks like in the current moment, when there is clearly, I think, so many demands, whether it is the individual, approach, whether it is the quote marketing of the self, a desire to be seen, and all of these factors that come into play. But what are your general thoughts on leadership in this moment? And I'm sure you have a lot to say, of course, as someone who has been covering, Black Lives Matter as a movement, but also what's taking place in Chicago. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, with regard to, finding another King or finding another Malcolm X, I don't necessarily think that we're moving in that direction. I think what we're saying with the Black Lives Matter movement is a more lateral, shared type of leadership that really is informed by the ways of women. It's more relational, less hierarchical, and it's less focused on a specific spot or individual person. And I think it's an invitation to identify the leader within, meaning that, who's the leader on the block, who's the leader in the community, who's the leader on your side of town, who's the leader in your town, in that sense. So I'm just looking at the future as more lateral, more level, and more in a shared responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's really the best way to frame it, because what is so powerful about this moment, and we saw that too, right, with the uprisings just over the last couple of months, is how much this is a moment of possibility for all of us, right? I mean, anyone who is committed to social justice can play a part as a leader, right, in whatever sphere of influence they have within their communities. And I just think that part is key, that we no longer need to wait for some charismatic one leader, right, to guide us all, but that we can emerge as the leaders in whatever way that we can. So I love the way that you've explained this. And I wonder too, as we're thinking about the current moment, if you could talk about COVID-19 and the way that it has affected your work, as a journalist, writer, and an activist, if you could reflect on that for a moment.
Well, it's made me so tired.
Yeah.
To work in this kind of environment on deadline all the time. But I mean, with the grand pivot that we all went through about a year ago this week, that was basically an opportunity for me and my colleagues to do what we do best, which is to center the people. The phenomenon of the disparate impacts did not surprise us. And so the one thing that we did at MLK50 is that, since people were being affected in their wallets, is that we paid community members to write their own story about how the pandemic was affecting them. Because our founder always says that the answer to poverty is money. And so, and also we didn't want to be extractive by asking people to tell a story for free to help us get a sense of how this was impacting us. But also we wanted to center these people because we needed to know from their perspective how they were experiencing the pandemic. So often we're told from all kinds of experts from the inside out, but we don't spend enough time asking people what is the experience of their lives, because they're the experts on their lives. Mm-hmm. And then when you start asking questions from that perspective, I mean, it just opens the door of possibility in terms of understanding and the kind of storytelling you could do. I want to go back to the previous statement about regular everyday experts, because I'm hooked on this guy on TikTok. His name is The Conscious Lee, and he studied gender studies in college, and he's a teacher. And I think he teaches at the college level now too. And he gives his history lessons. He gives these gender studies perspectives. I mean, he's like a leader in his own way through TikTok. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the other, right, the power of social media too, right, in this moment, opening up a space. Well, of course, we're drawing all these comparisons to the civil rights movement. Your book is on this, but we no longer need to necessarily wait for an opportunity to gather in a local church, for example, to strategize or to share one's ideas. That, in fact, you don't even necessarily need to leave your home, right, to be part of a broader community whereby you're able to share your thoughts, and you're able to, I think, be part of a movement for change. And social media makes that possible in such a powerful way. So that's a great example. Although I have to say, I feel a bit, strange, because I have yet to fully explore TikTok. I'm still, I know my students make fun of me because I'll say to them, I'm on Twitter, and they're just like, yeah, that's so like, no one's on Twitter. I'm like, no, I'm on Twitter. It's cool. It's hip, but I do want to ask you if you could talk about just looking toward the future. So this is one of the questions that came in, which I think is a perfect way for us to pull it all together. What is giving you hope in this current political moment?
Yes, well, the regime change gives me hope.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't, all the people that everybody wanted,
Mm-hmm.
but we identified a problem, and the nation, or half of it, came together and,
Right, right.
and did something about it. And I feel like that, for all of us who understand structural racism and all of these barriers and disproportionate impacts, who are grounded in this in our day to day,
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's easier to have conversations because the country came to the world came to a standstill, and people can see clearly what we were talking about.
Right.
So I think it was like sort of like it's been a level setting experience that will allow us to have richer conversations, especially me as a journalist, and the kinds
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
stories that I want to tell.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think over the last couple of weeks, and I think perhaps right after January 6th, right, with the insurrection, I heard so many people saying, "Listen, journalists have been, Black journalists in particular, have been trying to tell us, right, have been sounding the alarm for months, for years." And writing about the Trump administration in a way that they were trying to help, members of the broader public see where we were headed, right? And I think that was key. And I think about your work and just the work of so many others in drawing the connections that people didn't want to see as it pertains to race, as it pertains to white supremacy and nationalism, xenophobia, white nationalism, I should specify, and I think. Once again, in that moment, it was clear just the significant role that journalists play in our society. And I want to thank you for your work and for your continued efforts in that vein. And like you, I am hopeful as we look toward the future. We have just a few minutes. Could you tell us what new projects you're working on, what new initiatives that you're currently developing that we can look forward to in the days and weeks and months ahead?
Yeah. I'm in the throes of teaching right now. So I'm getting through the semester, trying to create an awesome experience for my students. But my goal is to build on depresencing in a memoir style book that actually riffs off the news also, and brings in other examples of how Black women have been depresenced, like Megan this week by
Oh,
the
yes.
Firm, by
Mhm.
Windsor Castle. Or there was a local comedian in Chicago, Erica Watson, died this week of COVID.
Oh.
And so my friends and I have been talking about some of the language that we have
Mhm.
been seeing being used around Erica's passing. She was
Sorry to hear
a
this. Yeah.
full-size Black woman. And so there are just so many examples. So I want to capture other people's stories of how this phenomenon has impacted them, and tell the story through my own personal story, and
Mhm.
hopefully say something of significance in the public
Mhm.
conversation that leads us to better understanding and better behaviors.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for this conversation, for agreeing to do this, and this is such a difficult time, as we're talking about COVID-19 and just the way that it is continuing to devastate so many lives. I think too, just about what might be framed as the silver lining of the moment is that it has forced, really forced so many of us to slow down, to stop, to reflect, and also to be in dialogue with each other in this virtual space. And this is something that I hope we could do in person in the future when it becomes possible to do it and safe to do it. But I'm just grateful that we had this conversation today. And I look forward to continually speaking with you and learning from you. And so once again, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be in your presence.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much to everyone watching. And